A number of environmental groups commissioned a poll about Calgarians' attitudes toward climate change and energy in the economy, and some fairly interesting insights came out of that poll. So I'm going to talk to pollster Brian Singh, who did the data analysis about it. Welcome to the interview, Brian.
Thank you, Markham.
Well, look, why don't we start with an overview of the poll, please?
Well, it does cover a number of topics, but in terms of findings, one of the things that the poll does clearly point to is there's an existential crisis within Calgary. And we can see that quite clearly that the vast majority of Calgarians want to see climate action, and they see climate action as very fundamental to the diversification of the economy, while at the same point, wanting to make sure that we have that transition away from fossil fuels covered off. So again, we do not want to see workers being left behind, and it is a bit of a paradox, and this is hence the crisis of how to balance the transition away from fossil fuels while accelerating the need for renewables and getting into the green economy.
So just to be clear, Brian, the existential crisis is both climate change and energy transition related.
Yes, very much so. But it's also where it starts to affect the psyche of Calgarians. So some of the questions that we do include are questions that are used internationally. For instance, we use a question on societal trust. I'm sure you've seen the Edelman, trust barometer out there, as well as Pew Foundation. They do a regular study on societal trust. So we use that question. And what we see within Calgary is that there are more people who are mistrusting of their society than trusting right now. Usually when we see that, the places that actually have the more mistrust than trust are the areas of the world where there's a little bit more corruption, a little less functioning society, not a well-designed financial system. That's where you see the extreme elements of mistrust. When you start to see that in a society where there's a high level of organization, there's something else going on. So we asked a question about happiness. That's another one that they use for measuring things like gross national happiness. And what we see is there's an equal number of people who are happy in the city as are unhappy. And it's a surprising number. It's almost 3 and 8 on both sides. So there's something going on within the psyche. We also use questions from the city's citizen satisfaction survey. We're asking about how they feel Calgary is a good place to make a living, a good place to make a life, about is the city on track for the next 10 years. And there's one other one there. I don't have everything absolutely memorized, but one thing that's very clear, triangulating those data against what we saw in the spring tracking that was undertaken by Ipsos I think it was back in April and May, we're seeing a drop in terms of calories on the right track to in the next 10 years. So people are not being optimistic about the future of Calgary.
Is this dissatisfaction with city government, with provincial government, with federal government? Can we parse that?
Well, we did ask questions about level of trust. And this was not published, but we did keep that in within the poll because we want to understand some of that dynamic. The odd thing is that the groups with the lowest level of trust are the politicians. We see very low rankings of people being trusting of their provincial politicians as well as their federal politicians, which is very odd because the vast majority of the politicians at the federal and provincial level are conservative in Calgary. So again, it's speaking to this sort of, well, we do have this structure in place, but we're not very satisfied with it because again, whatever's tribal is is felt to be more satisfactory to those people who are part of that tribe. I will say that the municipal politicians are also mistrusted, but not to the extent as the federal and provincial politicians. And they do tend to have a little bit more respect for the civic managers who work within the city as well.
So what about climate change? Brian, I lived in Calgary for 10 years, from 2000 to 2010. And I always thought that Calgary was a much more cosmopolitan place than it was often portrayed in the media, and sometimes even by Calgarians themselves, who always, wanted took on the, that conservative redneck kind of persona, but really weren't like that at all, personally, in the way they felt about issues in politics. But where are we now? It sounds like that's changed quite a bit.
I think it's very much at a crossroads right now. There's certain events that you just can't deny are happening, right? So we asked that question about the heat dome and how did that affect your point of view on climate change? And we see that about 1/3 of people very much said, yep, no, this confirmed everything I knew, and I've always wanted to see action on climate change. But there was 31% of people who said, no, this has absolutely changed my mind, and we need to take action now. So if you sum those two up, you have 2/3 of the population who are very much in the camp of saying we should do something around climate change right now. So when it comes down to, but I want to kind of get behind the numbers as well, right? So the people who are most probably, who are most opposed to anything that is related to climate action, they're very committed conservatives, very committed. And when we parse that, it's really about 30% of the population, which oddly enough translates to, if you look at our vaccination rates in Alberta, you can see that 70-30 divide very clearly here. And not to say that I'm saying that those people who oppose climate action are in that camp against vaccines, but there is a sense of there's a culture related to that. But if you go across the poll, when it comes down to matters related to climate action, it's always going to be in that 2/3 to 3/4 of people wanting to see action. I will add one more thing, is those people who want to see action, there's two other dimensions that really do make a difference. One is the length of time they spend in Calgary. The longer you spend in here, the more likely you are to oppose climate action. But the other thing too is the highest level of education is amongst the people who are way more inclined to want climate action at this point. So there are a few divides.
Right. Let's talk about oil and gas, because of course Calgary is the oil and gas epicenter of Canada. Wow. And how does that play into your survey?
We did ask a few questions about the role of the energy sector in the transition. And people are generally quite bullish about, we have the talent, we have the resources, and we have the skills to actually transition away from fossil fuels. I think that the other thing that is part of that is we still have a lot of sunk costs involved in the oil and gas sector. I also think that one thing that's very clear within the survey is the business leaders of Calgary do need to step up, and they do need to be much more active and be more proactive in their voice about saying that we want to get behind climate action now. Because the most committed conservatives do tend to look at this group, and this is a group that they trust the most. Because again, their livelihoods are most likely attached to that. So when it comes down to aspects of the transition, we're starting to see that people do get that we do have economists like to talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. Calgary has all the sufficient conditions that can be easily moved to the necessary conditions to actually go through that transition. But part of the problem is it's not happening fast enough at this point. And it will still take some time, which is also another challenge and contributes to the existential crisis.
Brian, really appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
You're most welcome. Thanks again.